Hi, I'm Kobe Lobaugh, and I am with Sam Houston State University, and we are doing a live-to-tape segment with a distinguished alumni named Morgan Chesky. Morgan Chesky went to Sam Houston State and has since been at NBC, KLTV, and in Seattle as a news reporter. Here's a collection of his work.
Certainly clear morning here in West Texas, where we are just minutes away from New Shepard rocketing skyward.
Here we go again. It was 6 weeks ago we stood on this exact balcony as Laura tore through this area.
We haven't seen any National Guardsmen yet, but we know there's at least 1,000 that arrived here today in Minneapolis.
In just a few hours, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is expected to visit the scene and speak with first responders. I want you to hear what one patient had to say who's now been inside this hospital for the past week. She held off on getting vaccinated, and now she regrets it. If you could go back in time and get the vaccine before all this, would you?
I would have got the shots, but no. I want to be hard-headed.
Right now, this group of 8 to 9 people has just come across the river. Border Patrol detained them as soon as they crossed. You can see adults and children here coming to the U.S. for the very first time.
We spoke to Border Patrol Station Chief Austin Scarrow in a rare interview.
Do you see this getting worse before it gets better?
Unfortunately, I do.
I'm standing in front of the 3rd precinct. We'll show that in just a second, but I want to show behind you where a new fire has been set by these crowds that at this point in time are free to roam around this area.
It was just a couple hours ago we caught the edge of the eye of Laura, and it was a very eerie, calm feeling for several minutes. Where the wind died down, we could survey some of the damage from near our hotel.
The governor said today they were not going to allow the damage that they have seen over the past several days here. This is proof. Tonight. Let's go.
Hold on, I gotta find this.
Law enforcement tonight, not taking any chances. We're now 2 to 3 blocks away from the 5th precinct of Minneapolis police. They are expanding that footprint by the second.
We talk about winterizing our homes and our cars, but out here on the farm, there's only so much you can do when it comes to Mother Nature. And that's led to scenes like this. Whole crops decimated. This cabbage, instead of headed to a restaurant or farmer's market, now left to just rot in the field.
A Tulsa police officer has instructed this woman that if she won't comply, they will remove her for trespassing, and that's what they're doing right now. Ma'am, if you can hear me, can you tell me what officers told you that you did wrong?
I was trespassing.
What did you come here today to do, ma'am? You had a ticket, right?
Yes.
They're loading Miss Buck into this cruiser. You heard her say that she is a Tulsa resident,
Right.
and that she came out here today to protest.
Thank you for a hug, please.
As a judge, when you see the brother of a victim hug the person responsible, what does that do?
I think it caught all of us off guard.
That embrace, certainly one moment. Another moment would have come with a second embrace.
It's not uncommon for me to talk to defendants either. She said to me, well, I don't even have a Bible.
You give her that Bible, and then she asks you for something else.
She said, can I hug you? I'm ashamed to say I paused. Your job is to do justice, to love mercy, and walk humbly. So how can you not hug this lady?
A walk down memory lane, and frankly, a very rewarding moment for me, because I think if you were to tell me back when I walked onto campus in 2004 that someday in 2022 I'd be coming back and chatting with you about the career I'm now blessed to have, I don't know if I would have believed you. It's been an incredible journey, marked with more than a few trials and tribulations. And, you know, I got to tell you, there's no other place I think that could have set the stage for me in journalism other than Sam Houston State.
So you're no stranger to Texas. Everyone knows you from NBC. But how did you get your start? What did we not know?
What do we not know about Morgan Chesky? Well, 5th generation Texan, grew up in Kerrville, Texas, and I was lucky to have a very broad view of the world at a very young age. I lived with my mom, sister, and my grandparents, and on more than one occasion in the morning when we'd walk down to the breakfast table, there would be a newspaper there with kind of a collection of the big stories happening all over the globe. A tsunami near Sri Lanka, some wildfire in Africa, a drought elsewhere, that made a Kerrville kid kind of realize how big our world is. And I think that coupled with the fact that I grew up in a household where every night at dinner we still gathered around the TV to watch the evening news, kind of made me realize that, Kerrville, Texas was a great place to grow up, but there was much more out there, and that essentially started my interest in exploring journalism as a potential career. My grandparents, on one of my younger birthdays, gave me what looked like just a rolled up piece of paper, and it ended up being a blank newspaper that had lines on it that were blank, and then squares for you to kind of paste in a photo or draw a picture. And I remember getting that and thinking it was the coolest feeling to be in charge of telling people kind of what was going on. It was this newspaper, if I remember correctly, the top story the day I was given it was O.J. Simpson on the run. And then it had other areas that I filled in sports-wise. And then from there, just a love for writing, a love for meeting new people, seeing new places, kind of naturally paved the way to journalism. I always, did debate, mock trial in high school. And then I thought, what could I do long-term career-wise that would enable me to kind of gather all of these things I enjoy? And covering the news, being a journalist, was kind of the natural answer. And frankly, coming to Sam Houston was a natural place to come to as well. This was the spot that when I visited the first time, my mom actually found it for me. She said, hey, I think you should, give this campus, give this school a shot. And we drove here from Kerrville, a nice 4.5-hour drive, and I walked on and saw the beautiful scenery, and I liked how communal the campus felt. And I had a chance to sit in on a class right here in the Mass Comm building, and I thought, this feels like home. And so it wasn't long thereafter that I made the choice to enroll here back in the day of fall 2004.
Was there a moment where in high school you were like, this is what I want to do. I know how I want to get there. I've been in the classroom. Did you have to change any habits as a student?
Did I have to change any habits as a student? Well, as my mom can attest, I had to wake up probably a little bit earlier. I had to take a bit more personal initiative, I think, when it came to just going to college. As far as if I had to change anything drastically, I wouldn't necessarily say so. I think it was just everyone grows up a lot in college. You have to. And when I came to SAM, fortunately, I found some mentors here in the program and on campus that definitely shepherded me and helped smooth out some rough edges, of which there were plenty, throughout my time here.
If you could teach a class at Sam Houston right now, what would you add to the curriculum?
Yeah, that's a good question. If I could teach any class at SAM, of which, I think they have the basis covered quite well, I do think that as a college student, as someone preparing to go out into the real world, and frankly, I could teach this, but there is no substitute for just facing struggles and frustration. And I think particularly if there was a way to convey to students on their way out the door that as much fun and as much as you've learned here, this is just the first tiny step of so many. And to succeed, it's not going to be exciting all the time. It's going to be frustrating. You're going to cry. You're going to face struggles you couldn't have even imagined during your time here. Obviously, there's no substitute for that other than going through it, but I think that really imparting the fact that mentality and attitude in the long run will supersede skills, I think that's something I would try to teach, I would at least share. Because whenever I left SAM, there were students here that were far more talented than me, had been significantly more involved. And I think once we got into the real world, we found out how bad you really want something. And to each their own. But for me, no matter how many times I did get knocked down or, made a mistake on a story, there's always another story and a new day. And I think that kind of applying that approach from one job to the next, Tyler, Austin, Oklahoma City, Seattle, my time with NBC in LA, Chicago, Miami, now Dallas, you learn that. And if you don't commit to that, it's going to be a rough ride.
So one thing Sam Houston is famous for is Dan Rather. The building we're in right now is named after Dan Rather.
I'm
as
aware.
the Dan Rather Communication Building. While you were doing your blank newspapers at a young age, did you look up to Dan Rather as a role model?
Well, I obviously had to look up to Dan, for sure. If my grandfather was choosing which news we were watching, it was CBS with Dan. If my grandmother was choosing, it was ABC with Peter Jennings. And then there was Tom Brokaw there, somewhere in the middle as well. And I think that Dan, particularly growing up in Wharton, Texas, another small town, I could kind of relate to that in a big way, being from Kerrville. And I remember coming here and seeing his name on this building and thinking, this icon walked right through these doors the same way that I'm about to. And it kind of struck me a little bit. Granted, it was a few decades prior, but I think his legacy more than left a mark here. And as I was going from station to station during my time with local news, in the back of my mind, I did think about Dan's progression, ending up at KHOU during the time where there was a massive hurricane, and his coverage of that hurricane led to his opportunity with the CBS network in New York. And I had faith that if you just stuck to it, maybe that door could open for me. And then, fortunately, back in late 2018, I was given that opportunity, joining NBC News. And I got to tell you, I can't say Dan Rather without telling the story, because I had just finished up a week as a new correspondent. They put you in a room for a writing workshop. They give you a million different types of stories to write, and they kind of critique your writing and the way in which you tell it. It's a little intense. The final day, they took us all out to lunch. And I'm about 10 days into NBC at this point. And we walk into this restaurant right there, just a few blocks from 30 Rock, and a colleague of mine says, "Hey, Morgan, didn't you say you went to the same school Dan Rather did?" I go, "Yeah, why?" She goes, I think that's him. And I got to tell you, I mean, call it providence, call it coincidence, call it whatever you want. I look over, and there is the Bearcat himself, Dan Rather. And being a respectful of privacy guy, I had to break that rule. And I walked over, and I kind of hovered above the table. He was talking with a few colleagues, and, as I'm sure he's done many, many times, he kind of pauses and looks up and says, "Can I help you?" And I say, "Dan, sorry to interrupt, but from one Bearcat to another, I just had to say hey." And his eyes lit up. And he says, "Bearcat, well, you have a seat right here." So I sat next to Dan, and we chatted for a few minutes. I told him, "Hey, we're not doing too bad. Kid from Kerrville, boy from Wharton, here we are," right? And he got a kick out of that. And it was just a moment that I think will stick with me forever. And he leaned over at the end and shared a few words of encouragement and support that I'll keep between us. And then we shook hands and we parted ways. And if that's not fate, I don't know what is.
So one similarity we have, aside from going to Tyler, is I'm able to watch you on NBC right now. During your time here at SAM, you were able to watch Dan Rather. While you were watching him, did you apply that to what your career path was? Did you take notes and be like, "I'm going to do that next. I'm going to incorporate that"?
I think during my time at SAM, I was aware of Dan, I was aware of Tom, of Peter. These are icons in the world of journalism. I think I was also self-aware enough, though, to know that it would be a long, long road before I would actually be needing kind of their specific skill set. So I watched a lot of Houston news, San Antonio news, what I grew up watching in Kerrville, and I would try to find a reporter or an anchor whose style I admired, who was, could tell a clear, concise, compelling story without maybe getting overly dramatic about it. And I think it was during my time at SAM that I really started to kind of hone in on that a little bit. Not to emulate maybe one person in particular, but I think the more you can kind of gather tool-wise from a variety of people, the better off you'll be. So definitely it was in college and during my time at internships that it wasn't just a major anymore. This is a career that I'm going to stick with, and that's kind of when I started to key into what I would really need going forward to succeed.
You mentioned internships. Tell us about the New York internship you had while you were at SAM.
So I actually walked in May of 2008, and backtrack a few months. It's my senior spring, as I'm sure pretty much everyone can attest. Not necessarily the most productive time as a college student. You see you're on your way out. You kind of have your future in store. You know you're going to get your degree at this point, but my mother, kudos to her, had said, hey, there's a Dan Rather internship on campus. I go, Mom, definitely not going to get that. That goes to the top 1 or 2 students in the department, of which I am not. She goes, okay, well, CBS has an internship program. So I looked at the form and I thought, I think I could write a pretty good little essay here. And I was graced with some incredible recommendations by my professors here. And I was fortunate enough to, go to New York. The summer after walking, I had an independent study course that I applied for here, registered for here. And I worked with the CBS Evening News and the CBS Weekend News. And I think it was at that point, small town kid in the big city. I mean, that's a story in and of itself, but figuring out the subway system, et cetera. I think also just being in the room with some of the brightest minds in journalism and witnessing how they interacted, how they talked stories through, how they worked together as a team to put 2 minutes of television on each night. No one would have any idea that, one single story required a master class in logistics from getting a correspondent from point A to point B, and then finding an interview, and then directing that photographer there. And it opened my eyes to just how big journalism, how powerful journalism could be when you work as a team. Which at the network, it very much is, it's a team sport everywhere, but particularly at the network whenever you have so many people being able to contribute to a single story.
Walking around today, you've mentioned the flashbacks and familiarity the campus has. Mm-hmm. Did you ever think that you would write an NBC News story in our own LSC?
I mean, I didn't ever think I'd write an NBC News story, period. I was just trying to get from one great station to the next. I remember being in Tyler and thinking if I could only get to Austin. And then I remember being in Austin, if I could only anchor a little bit more in a bigger market, Oklahoma City. If I could only anchor in a major market, then made it Seattle. Man, if I could only work at the network. And then, I'll never forget covering a tornado on Alaska between Huntsville and Houston. And I was running on about 2 hours sleep. Had been there all day, and I pulled in. I walked into the LSC Student Center, and I was struck at just seeing the students working on whatever, and then I plopped down onto a couch just like them, and it was surreal. Surreal is the only word to really describe it, because, as much as I had hoped to succeed, I don't think I ever had the confidence enough to speak it into existence until, really the job actually happened. Yeah.
And going off of confidence, before you were NBC, you were already an award-winning journalist. So your time at Seattle, there was a cold case story, correct?
Right, Misty Copsey. Obviously, I'm sure many people in the audience here may or may not be fans of Dateline, but I was aware, my sister is a huge fan of Dateline, and so while I was in Seattle, I thought to myself, hey, what cold cases are out there that people should get a second look at? And there was a young 14-year-old girl, Misty Copsey, who went to a county fair back in the early 90s and told her mom she was going to get a ride home with a friend, never showed up. And fortunately, we had archive footage from the initial reporting of that story, And we were able to work with detectives and investigators who were kind of reopening the case to take another look at it and share it with the public. The search for the rest of her story as for what happened is still out there, but it felt important to be able to kind of bring a local story and give it new life into the public, keep them top of mind. Because for the families of those affected by those stories, I mean, every day is a struggle. Never goes away.
Absolutely. One thing a lot of East Texans know is the Thunder Call from KLTV with Mark Skirdo.
Oh, yeah.
What I've always noticed is while I'm in my small windowless interior room, there's always a reporter out there getting the story. So at what point does personal safety override getting the story or the information to the public?
Personal safety and getting a good story, that's a question we ask ourselves pretty much, if not daily, on every big story. And I've had to kind of talk my way through that in hurricanes, in protests, in fires, and there's never an easy answer. I think as a journalist, one of the things that drives you is you want to be on the front lines of history. You want to see it, you want to touch it, and you want to be there. And there is a fine line. And the trick is knowing where that is. And in hindsight's 2020. There's of course a few situations that perhaps I could have been more cautious on. I'm here today, I'm okay. But that's a great point. And I think that, no story is worth harm to yourself, to your crew, to anyone gathering. And if you operate within that framework, you should be all right. But it's absolutely something, particularly in light of how the media is viewed today, that we're hyper aware of.
Absolutely. Is there something that you wished you had learned here at Sam Houston that you only learned in the career field?
Maybe how to put on a microphone correctly, or how to fix a broken tripod. I remember my first few months at my first job in Tyler were pretty rough. And I attest that to maybe not being as active in the department as potentially I could have been, where I, probably could have learned some tricks of the trade. However, I wouldn't have traded any of those experiences, because each mistake gives you something to learn from. I'm just, as far as what I'd learned that I hadn't, I think Sam Houston set the stage as well as they could have. I think that, I was definitely a bit naive, but, part of growing up and getting out there is just learn by doing. So, yeah, no regrets.
Were there life lessons you learned outside the classroom? Because you had a lot to balance with Greek life, Channel 7, and being a university ambassador.
Sure, it was a heavy load. I appreciate that. So that's my excuse for maybe not being in the building as much as I should have. As far as you ask what lessons
life lessons outside the classroom.
I think my life lessons for me came before I really came to Sam in earnest. I lost my dad to a heart attack my sophomore year of high school. And I think that in that moment and in the months following that, at a young age, I was shown that our time here is pretty precious. And the people that we share our time with is also pretty special. And nothing should be taken for granted. Also, you lose someone that you're that close with. And, little things in life that are maybe frustrating or annoying in the moment lose a lot of their power over you. And I think it puts you in a place where you're able to kind of draw some valuable perspective there. To each their own, from an experience standpoint, from a life journey, absolutely. But for me, losing him when I did definitely made me, I think, appreciate the present a little more. And it made me realize that, we really have to you have to actively work on yourself to maximize your time here.
Absolutely. I may have only met you today, but judging by the smile on your mom's face, I'm sure your dad's proud of you where you are now.
I appreciate that.
So, moving on, do you believe that more effort than just what is in classes and just what is on campus is required to get a job? Like going the extra mile?
Going the extra mile, literally. I'll circle back to that. I think that anyone can come to class and have a good experience and make good grades and get a decent job. Kobe, I think that they'll be just fine. I think that if you look in any industry, the people that separate themselves from the pack do so because of what they take it upon themselves, the extra work. For me, I was able to get that first job, but then upon hearing a boss tell me that as a reporter I was fine, but as an anchor I was mediocre at best, it was a bit of a gut check. Had to find a speech coach who kind of shared with me some ways I could grow from a TV standpoint. I think that, it's just been a journey for sure. And
Your work has taken you to some pretty far off places, as far as Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
What are your experiences going to all these places?
Every place I've been to, has a different story to tell. Cuba, Israel, England, filling in for our London bureau. What has it taught me? You think? Yeah. I think that when you travel and when you meet new people, the world gets a lot smaller, and a little more humanity is shown. And I think it's real easy to sit in front of a TV and to see a place on a screen with an event happening there, and to kind of mentally take that event and use it as your only point of reference for not only an entire nation, but maybe every individual who lives there. I think the Israeli-Palestinian situation, ongoing conflicts, is very interesting in that you see all these flashpoints happening on the news, and then you go over there and you walk the streets and you meet the people on both sides, and you see everyone living their lives, many of them in harmony. And you realize how much deeper life is beyond what you see on TV. And fortunately for us, it's our job to kind of show some of that depth. It's not always possible to show the true extent of it unless you take someone there to witness that. But I think that's one of the reasons that I try to have traveled to as many places as I have, whether it be for work or for personal reasons, because I don't like feeling out of the loop, and I don't like feeling like I don't understand, whether it be a story or a society, a people, a place. And so I think the more knowledge we can expose ourselves to and the more places we can, the more ignorance we're able to do away with. And fortunately for me, it's my job to kind of maybe pull the curtain back and share that with everyone else.
Do you believe you have reached your full potential, or is there a goal after this?
Absolutely. No, as of yesterday, the full potential was reached, and I'm excited to tell you that it feels amazing. Absolutely not. In fact, I'm not really a golfer. However, I do liken journalism, television news to golf, in that there is always something you can work on. I mean, writing a faster, tighter script, compelling, doing a better interview, presenting in a different way, being more conversational. I mean, take your pick, man. That I am at a place where everyone I work with can do the job and do it well. It's now incumbent upon me to, as comfortable as I am in a variety of situations, I don't know, give myself a bit of a gut check and say, hey, you could work on this, you could work on this. It wasn't but a week ago, I was doing a live shot on mask mandates at airports, and Twitter, blessing and a curse that it is, a very kind woman somewhere watching in the country let me know that she had to stop watching me because I said and just too much. And as, you know, it's easy to laugh at now, but in the moment, got to tell you, hey, someone's always watching. And it's my job to, as clearly as possible, share what's going on. So I have not reached my full potential. If I do, please let me know.
Absolutely. If you're saying and a lot, I'm worried about the rest of us. So I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I have noticed that when I do archive stuff, the reporters on location are often the only thing we have because of their job. Walter Cronkite is associated with the Apollo era. Every time you look at something NASA related from the 60s, you joined NBC in 2018. Mm-hmm. Do you think you were entering an era with COVID-19 and all the political turmoil that's happened?
You know, history will be the real person to answer that, but because we don't know what the next story is, right? I believe that I was fortunate to get with NBC when I did because it gave me all of 2019 to kind of get my sea legs, if you will, and understand how the network works. And then, of course, COVID changed the game for everyone. I mean, it will absolutely be a chapter that will be in history books forever, that will outlast all of us. I would like to think that as far as the era goes, that we will come out of the pandemic era and I will be less defined by that and more able to say, yes, I covered that. Because, you know, the beauty of this job is that, you know, there's always a new chapter on the way. There's always a new story. And while I know the pandemic was incredibly tough, I mean, that's an understatement on everybody to varying degrees. People lost loved ones. People couldn't see loved ones. People were cut off, feeling isolated. We had to rewrite the book on how we covered events. I sat on planes alone, going from point A to point B. That's certainly the chapter right now, the era, I think, that we're still in, hopefully coming out of sooner than later. So I'll be associated with it, but I hope that, you know, I believe brighter days are ahead, and I'm less interested about the past chapter and more interested about what the next one is.
So here at the school, we have industry standard equipment, and we have the equipment room that we're able to check stuff out of. Have you noticed a difference reporting as technology has evolved?
Yeah.
Like at ease or something you wish you had while you were here at SAM?
A smaller camera. Yeah. I'll never forget checking out one of the large news gathering cameras here in the office just outside the door, and I was doing a story about the University Hotel. It was expanding, I think, to some degree. I put my tripod up, set my camera on the tripod, and there is a locking mechanism that connects the camera to the tripod that I thought I had clicked in that I had not. And the camera had a nice tumble, cracking on the asphalt. And I look at it, small crack, okay. We can work through this. I put it back in the case. I took it, turned it back in, didn't say a word. The next day, I'm in class. Professor says, before we get started, I want to talk about something, and that is care of equipment. And he opens up the case and pulls out the camera. He goes, I don't know who rented this, but can you please just come forward and own the fact that you didn't know what you were doing? And so I let class go through, and I let everybody walk out. It might have even been this room. And I say, hey, he goes, it was you, wasn't it? Yeah. It was me, and you know, I'm waiting tables. If I need to contribute some cash to the cause to fix his camera, I'm certainly able. He's like, stop. Just, do you know how this works? You know, clicks into the tripod. All right, now you click into the tripod. Okay. All right, now do it again. Click in. All right, you're good. Got it. So yeah, that was, I think just, you know, obviously little things like that you learn by doing, and I wish I had maybe had that at smaller cameras. But what's so wild is that with my phone now, at the network level, in breaking news, I can find someone on a scene and I can hold that phone up and I can interview them. And then it can be on the newscast that night in front of a few million people. And you would be hard pressed to pick out what was shot on a fancy camera and what was shot on an iPhone. And I think to the technology point, I mean, I'm glad we are where we are. It certainly helps us. I think more importantly, it's allowed individuals to share their stories without us necessarily. Whereas in the past, maybe it would have taken a news crew to get somewhere, to interview someone, to put it on the news. Now, in times of crisis, you know, particularly Ukraine, perfect example, you're seeing men, women, children flip that camera around from a basement in Kyiv or Mariupol and share the despair that they're going through during this war because of the advances in technology.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting you mentioned the broken camera lenses because those are now teaching tools. Our professor
Happy to be a part of the
comes out
process.
and
Yeah.
he shows us how it works before we can break another one.
There you go.
But so they're still in use. You have some very interesting stories like the Fort Hood shooting and the church arsons in Tyler. Would you care to share any of your most exciting on-location stuff?
Yeah, there's one story. I have one story from my time in local news and one story from my time with NBC, and it was during my time whenever I was in Oklahoma City, and you know, it was my third job. Obviously, I thought I had it all figured out by then, and I was still, in hindsight, pretty young, and a tornado had struck in May, and we were covering the damage. Nobody was really hurt. It was, if you're going to have a tornado, it was about as optimal a situation as you could have. And while we were covering the damage, we heard a walkie-talkie on a deputy's hip kind of buzz. Said, hey, touchdown. It's looking like it's headed to Moore. And Moore, Oklahoma is just south of Oklahoma City. And so I looked at my young photographer who I think had just graduated college a few years prior. And I had been paired with him to teach him about the business. So needless to say, we were, you know, quite a team. Young reporter that had just been a few years in, matched with a rookie, and there was a tornado on the ground. So we hightail it to Moore, but we come in from the south because the tornado kind of tore through and crossed the interstate and blocked everyone trying to come in from the north. And so we were some of the first news crews in the city after this tornado struck. And I'll never forget driving through this neighborhood where there was no damage, but then we turned a corner and there were dozens of children and adults, teachers, muddy and bleeding. So I stop the car. I get out and I ask them who they are. They say, we just crawled out of what's left of Briarwood Elementary, one of two elementary schools that this tornado in 2013 hit. And there was a teacher frantic with a spiral notebook, just kind of going through with a pen. I say, what are you doing? She goes, these are all the kids that we got out of the school. We don't have any way of reaching their parents because cell phone service was out temporarily. She goes, we're just holding them here to make sure that they're safe until we can reconnect them with their family. And so I turned to my photographer. I say, hey, put the mast up on the live truck. I go, we're going to be going live from here for a while. And so for the next 3 hours, we read the names of these students off. And little by little, we would see parents kind of come running up from different directions. And because they had seen where we were in our reporting, you know, they were able to come find their kids. And, you know, I'll never forget a father telling me that he had gotten stuck in traffic because the interstate had been hit, and he just ditched his car and started just running in the general direction of where we were a couple miles before he stumbled upon us. And then there was the sixth grader named Brady who was in a classroom whenever the tornado struck, and he said that they took everyone into a closet, and the teacher covered their bodies with hers, and it, saved his life. And I think that, that's something that'll stick with me for a very long time.
That's a brilliant use of your job to get that done.
Yeah.
Is there any advice you would give students that how to use technology, how to get where you are?
I think they know. I would ask them, how do you use technology? I think that technology is moving so quickly these days that, students here at SAM are going to be significantly more equipped to handle the changes than perhaps I was. I'm trying to keep up just like everybody else. All I can say is learn to adapt. Don't be afraid to try new things, because odds are they're going to change sooner than later.
All right. And on that note, let's go directly into questions. If you're just tuning in, I have a special guest. His name is Morgan Chesky. He's currently the NBC news correspondent, and he's an alumni here from Sam Houston State University. If anyone in the audience, yes, sir.
Morgan, I'm Greg Smith with Sam Houston Memorial Funeral Home here in Huntsville. I've got a two-part question for you. The first question would be, whenever you've received an assignment that you were going to go cover a story, what stands out in your mind as being the most exciting? You couldn't wait to get there. I can't believe I'm going to go get to cover this. And then on the other hand, the assignment that you received that you just couldn't believe you had to go cover this, that you were either afraid or just absolutely didn't want to go.
Thanks, Greg.
Before we answer that, for our viewers on live TV, I will repeat the questions in the audience. So the gentleman just asked a two-part question. What stands out as the most exciting thing that Mr. Chesky has covered, and what assignment was he afraid to cover?
Greg, thanks for the question. Great ones. I've been blessed to cover some pretty cool stuff. I covered the Final Four and the Masters and a tornado over the course of 1 week about 3 weeks ago. So that's just incredible in and of itself. But as far as the one story that I still can't believe that I covered, to this day, I was in Seattle. I've been a reporter in Seattle and an anchor in Seattle for about 2 weeks. And say what you will about Twitter. I'm scrolling Twitter, and Alaska Airlines says, excited for our journey across the ocean and space when we intersect an eclipse over the Pacific. And I looked into it, and apparently they had changed a flight path from Anchorage, Alaska to Honolulu, Hawaii in order to catch an eclipse at 30,000 feet. Pretty cool. So I tweet at them, I say, hey, got room for one more? LOL. And they said, actually, yes. And so I call my boss, and I'm still very much the new guy. And I say, hey, I need a photographer to meet me, 5 a.m. tomorrow, go to Seattle Airport, fly to Anchorage, Alaska, then interview some people, fly to Honolulu. By the way, we're going to see an eclipse. He says, do it. So fortunately, I had my dad's Hawaiian shirt in the closet, threw that in the bag, and we interviewed these scientists in Anchorage when we get there that study eclipses. And they're called umbrophiles because the umbra is the name of the shadow that the eclipse makes. And I'm learning all this on the fly. And I'll never forget interviewing this gentleman who actually reached out to Alaska Air, and he was the one who said, hey, you should do this. And his name was Joe, and he goes, Morgan, catching an eclipse is, I'm trying to remember his exact words, but he goes, I wouldn't tell my wife that an eclipse is better than sex, but I wouldn't not say that either. And I just looked at him and I thought, all right, well, thank you, Joe, for that. Yes, and it absolutely made the piece, by the way. And so we're over the Pacific Ocean. They hand out these special glasses, and for 2 minutes and 52 seconds, we see sun, moon, earth align, and it became eerily dark, beautifully dark, while we were flying above the ocean. And then it passed, and everyone clapped. They handed out Mai Tais. And we landed in Honolulu that night, and I got to report live from Hawaii, where I'd never been, in a Hawaiian shirt, about this eclipse that took place. And they said, "Great job, by the way, you're off tomorrow, so when can we expect you back?" I said, "Not tomorrow." And the next day, went on a hike, took a surf lesson, explored, and I remember vividly thinking, if I never work in news again, I'm okay. I'm gonna be all right. So that was my favorite that I couldn't believe. As for a story that I was fearful of, I would never say afraid. I think that apprehensive might be a better word. And I think it would probably be covering a hurricane. I think covering Hurricane Ida in Louisiana this past year, I had wanted to get into the heart of the zone where this storm was going to strike. And I took my crew into a parking garage in Home, Louisiana, where we knew it was reinforced. It was not going to be torn down. And we rode the hurricane out, Category 4, for hours and hours and hours inside this parking garage where the wind would shift, and we'd have to shift our position because the wind would be coming from this way, but then when the storm goes here, it's now coming from this way. So we're kind of moving around throughout the garage as the storm passes. My photographer had never covered a hurricane before. I told him, always keep a hand on your camera and tripod because the wind shifts. We know how that story ends up. So fortunately, we had a backup camera. And that was a point where my takeaway was, to your safety question earlier, I wasn't fearful, but I was apprehensive. And in hindsight, I don't know if we would have pressed that hard to get that close, because there's a moment when a hurricane hits you where there is no one that can help you, and you're on your own. And that not only from a physical safety standpoint, but from a communication standpoint too, because you can lose contact with kind of the outside world, if you will. Even if it's just an hour's drive away, it might as well be on another planet. And so that was a moment that, I think maybe a little scared. Okay.
So we've got time for about 2 more questions. Is there anyone else that would like to ask Morgan something?
So, hi, I'm Elizabeth. I'm a senior here. You deal with a lot of emotional topics. How is that you maintain a professional setting?
So Elizabeth asked, how do I maintain my composure covering all these difficult topics? It's a good question, and the answer has shifted, Elizabeth. So whenever I started, I'm just a young, hardworking reporter covering the news. Hey, super sad story, but tell me how it feels. Hey, I'm sorry to ask you this, but XYZ. And I think that as I've gotten older, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if your heart gets bigger or what, but you're certainly more aware of, I think, what people are going through. Maybe that comes with having witnessed it on multiple stories now, but it's so interesting. Maybe I got a little emotional talking about that tornado, but in the moment I was covering it, there was no time for that. It was, hey, we got to get these parents to these kids, and that's all you can think about. It's not until well after the fact, maybe when you circle back, that the gravity of the moment kind of hits you. And so, there's never say never, but whenever you're covering an important topic or a story, breaking news, you certainly feel it in the moment, but I think there is, you have to realize that you're there for a reason, and that's to let people know what's going on. And, in private, there absolutely is some sorting things out, for sure. Absolutely.
I think we've got time for about 1 more question.
Mom, we'll catch up later.
Hi, my name is Shaylin Goodwin. I'm a mass communications major here at SAM. I was wondering, when you were facing COVID-19, what were some struggles that you personally faced in the world of journalism, and how did you overcome that?
Gotcha. Struggles covering COVID-19, and say your name for me again?
Shaylin Goodwin.
Shaylin Goodwin. Shaylin, good question. Covering COVID changed the game for all of us. I got it, and I'll never forget losing my sense of taste and smell, and then realizing I just became a statistic. And kudos to the company for letting me take about a month to recover, and I was one of the lucky ones. I didn't have to go to a hospital. I was just felt very tired and very ill, and it kind of had felt like my brain was a little foggy. But I think the struggle was we got so used to being able to have this kind of human connection, right? You have a story, you go meet the person, you interview them. Now, all of a sudden, everything's with a screen on it, or with a mask on, or not at all, because of just someone maybe's high risk, so they have to stay in. And I think from one of the reasons I was drawn to this job is that, you love kind of communicating with people, right? You love interacting with them, meeting new people, and that kind of it didn't stop it entirely, but it changed it, and there was a disconnect, I think, that was created. So that was rough. Obviously, we worked our way around it. Hats off to Zoom. If I never see another Zoom call, I'll be okay. And it's become a tool. But, I think that COVID taught us, blessing and a curse. Blessing in how we adapted in order to be able to continue to tell that story. But just a curse for the fact that I think many of us are still kind of, even though here in Texas we've been going mask-free for a while, I think we're still, as a society, kind of finding our way out of it a little bit. So yeah, good question.
So that is all the time we have today. Thank y'all at home for tuning in for our live broadcast, and thank you to the audience members for coming and asking those great questions. Morgan, I think this goes to show that what sending a tweet can do. So whether it's an eclipse ride on an airplane or an alumni coming to campus. So thank you all and have a good day.
Thank you, Kobe.
Absolutely.